And so last week we talked about designing characters, and that kind of leads into some of the early labs, especially for the art and the programming, where you're working with the player in the game. So designing what the player is going to look like and setting up the player functionality. And all of those things are kind of like related to character design and how the character functions within our game. So we spent a little bit of time thinking about that, and most of you guys will start actually working on the characters if you're doing that this week on Thursday. But we also want to start thinking about the setting for our games. And there's a bunch of labs that are related to creating the setting. Some of the aspects of the setting are things that we just look at, like they're just things that we can see in the game. And some of them are interactive, like platforms and obstacles and characters and things like that. And the game setting is very important to the game. And I want to start thinking about where our games are set and how do we represent the setting in the games. Like, how do we signify to the players where they are as they're playing the game, how we can do that. And that's another big part of what makes games fun, I think. A lot of what makes games fun to play is the mechanics of the game, like the, jumping and shooting stuff and getting points and defeating levels and solving puzzles. Like, all of those things are what we tend to think of when we think of game design. But the setting is also a really important aspect of the game because it creates, it lends itself to sort of the immersiveness of the game, or the feeling that we're like inside of the game world, which is a very important part, not just for like how the game looks, but also how the player feels when they're playing the game. Do they feel like they're inside a cohesive world? So that's what we want to think about when we think about game setting. How do we create that sense of immersiveness, that the player is actually inside of the world rather than just kind of, playing a puzzle or solving a puzzle from outside? And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. I'm going to be talking in this lecture just kind of about, what we see, what we signify in the game world. But this is like one of my personal favorite parts of games, because one of the cool things about games is they're usually, unlike, movies or things like that, we're drawing the setting, or we're creating the setting virtually or with 3D models or whatever it is that we're using to create the setting. So we don't really have any limitations as far as where a game can take place. It's sort of like a cartoon in that sense. And so that can be a big advantage of a game. We can have games set in space or underwater or in, different made up environments. And that can really add to the sense of exploration or, the novelty of a game that kind of goes beyond just like the game mechanics of puzzles and things like that. We're also talking about game setting now just because as we move through the labs in the semester, a lot of the stuff that we're building is going to become more complex. But right now we're still kind of just like building the graphics and adding stuff into the scene. And so with the game setting, a lot of these elements won't actually be interactive. They'll just be things that we draw and then put into the game. Anyway, let's take a look at these slides and talk more about game setting. So this is like a fish tank that I really like. I like Googling, fish tank images and looking at different types of fish tanks. And the thing that I like about this is that it's using like a very few limited elements to create a sense of an entire world. And so there's the architectural aspect to this, like how the different fish bowls are kind of connected is very creative. Then there's like the scenic aspect to this, like each one of the fish bowls has, some green foliage, but then they all have also different colors. Like there's one that has some red, there's one that has some purple. So they kind of have these separate different rooms basically. And then you have like the basic elements like the sand at the bottom and of course the water that creates this world. So it's a very few elements, but it creates this like very cohesive world just through this like very simple kind of architectural setup. So that's what I kind of like to start with. We'll look at a few different things that are kind of similar to this to get inspiration for where we're going to set our games. One thing that we want to talk about, so a couple terms or terminology when it comes to talking about what we see in the game is game setting versus world building. I would guess that most of you guys probably know what I mean by this, but just to kind of go over it. So these are related concepts, but they are talking about different specific things. World building is this kind of more general practice of creating the fictional universe where a story takes place. And I feel like that's been, people talk about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe a lot. I don't actually know a whole lot about that, but I think that's probably the most like mainstream example of world building that we're all probably familiar with, where there's like common characters, there's common, stories, there's common like physics, there's common locations, like all these things that are built into a universe. That's world building. That's like creating the fictional universe. Game setting is like actually using visual elements to tell the story of that world. So, if our game is set in outer space, we might know as a developer, like our game is in outer space, but how do we communicate that to the player? There's a lot of easy ways to do it. Like we can take away gravity, we can add spaceships, we can add stars, but we need to think about these scenic elements. And you guys will start to see as we're creating the game, it takes a long time to build a game, to add the art, to create good designs and all these things. So when we are starting to think about our game setting, we want to be very specific. We can't add like everything that you would need to add to actually recreate space, right? That would take forever. So what we need to do is think, what are the sort of like essential elements that we want to communicate our fictional world of the game through the elements in our scene. So the fictional world is going to be much larger in scope. It could be, basically infinite, but the player is only going to see a few of those elements. And so we have to choose those elements. The setting reveals those aspects of the world to the player. And so we need enough details of this world that the player can understand the basic premise or the logic of what's happening in our game world. So another thing that we want to disambiguate, or kind of like, the two different terms that we want to understand the difference of, is game setting versus level design. I'm sure you guys kind of have a sense of what both of these things mean, but let's talk about like their specific different meanings. So the game setting, obviously, as we've been talking about, refers to the objects, backgrounds, other visual elements that create the scene of the game. The level design is how we kind of direct the player through our world or through our levels based on interaction. And so the setting and the level design kind of interact, they work together, but they are different things. Like they can exist independently of each other. Ideally, they act together. Like the things that we see are also part of the level. But that's not necessarily always the case. Like we could have, a game set in space, but there's trees in the background, and that would create some sort of cognitive dissonance or dissonance between what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. And so we want to think through the elements that we put in our game so that the player understands where they are and has that feeling of immersiveness as they're playing. So let's talk about a few different types of game worlds. I guess it helps to know where your game is set. You don't actually have to, and you can change it, and you can kind of throw stuff in and discover where your game is set that way. But ideally, we know where the game is set when we start, and then we choose what we put into that world to create the setting. So let's think of some games that take place in these different types of worlds. So one type of world is fantasy. We can give a definition for fantasy, but first let's see, what are some games that you think of is in the fantasy setting? That's a good one. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, those are all good examples. What do those things that have in common? Like what separates fantasy from other settings? Exactly. So it's pretty simple, things that just don't exist in the real world. And so if our game takes place in a fantastic world where we have things like magic, we need to communicate that to the player. So if something fantastic happens, it shouldn't be like a big surprise unless that's, part of the story or something like that. But we can design our scene. If we look at the games that you guys mentioned, there are aspects of the way that they're designed, like the types of characters and the types of settings that communicate to the player there are fantastic elements in this world. So there are things that don't exist in reality. And so that sets up the player's expectations for what they might be able to do, whether they can, fly or transform into another creature or cast spells or whatever those fantastic elements may be. We want to communicate those possibilities to the player. Dragon Quest and Child of Light. I don't know Child of Light. I'll have to look at that, but that sounds like it could be a good option. Okay, let's keep going. So a perspective world. This is a game where something about the character's perspective is changed. Does anybody have an idea of what... that one's a little bit more specific, but does anybody have any ideas of what games that might be? Or games that would fit into that? No worries. So we're going over different settings for games. There's the different types of settings and sort of what makes them different. And we already talked about fantasy. So now we're talking about perspective world. This is one that is maybe a little more niche. But it basically means that the main character, something about their perspective on the world is different from the rest of that world. I'm gonna, if you guys have any examples, we can do that, and then I'll give you one of my examples. I see a few people are typing. Life is Strange. I don't know that game. It sounds familiar. Let's take a look. Life is Strange is a series of primarily episodic graphic adventures published by da-da-da. Okay, that sounds... What is the name of that game again? Oh, yeah, yeah. That's like one of those games that I've always been meaning to play, but I've never gotten around to. Which style was it? Or which character? Oh yeah, Pyro is armed with a flamethrower, which can set players on fire. Shotgun and a fire axe. Can also produce a blast of compressed air. Deluded and believes they are living in a utopian fantasy world. Yeah, that's actually a good example. That's a really good example. So he sees the world differently from everybody else in the game. So yeah, that's a good example. That makes sense. Let's look at the... Oh, there's a bunch. I still don't understand what Life is Strange is about. I'm going to look at this again. Gameplay. Graphic adventures played from a third-person view. Puzzle solving. Branching options. Oh, she can rewind time. Sorry, what? Okay, I think I see in Life is Strange, the character has the ability to rewind time. So that's a good example. You can change the environment. So they can create a different perspective on the world. So that makes sense. I think that is maybe what is meant. Superliminal. I've heard of that. I don't remember what that is. offhand. Superliminal. First person. Oh yeah, I watched this trailer. This is actually like a really good example because it's literally changing like your visual perspective on the world. So that's a great example. I've been wanting to play this. This is pretty new, right? Okay, last year, so it's almost a year old. But yeah, I heard about this recently. So that's a good example. 12 minutes. Is 12 minutes a game? Let's see. Interactive. Huh. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah. Okay. I think so that makes sense, but I think it's also maybe we might need to differentiate between like perspective as in like visual perspective, like 3-point perspective or something like that, versus like your psychological perspective or like the character's perspective. Oh, 12 minutes is basically ground. Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So the player's living the same day over and over again. Okay, that makes sense. That's a good one. Okay, so these are good examples. This one is like a little more. This one is like, the examples are always kind of varied. The one that I was thinking of, which is actually one that a student last semester gave, which I think is like a great one, is the game Octodad. That one is the character is like an octopus who's pretending to be a person, and so his perspective on the world, the way he interacts with the world is different because he's like, he's an octopus, he's not a person, but he's literally trying to pretend to be a person. So the mechanics of the game, all the physics of the game are built from that premise. So that's another, example of a perspective world where there's something about the main character that's different from the rest of the world, and that kind of informs the gameplay. And there's a lot of different examples. You guys have given some really good examples of this. Yeah, that's a good one. So our world, that one's pretty obvious. It's just the real world. Do you guys have any, what are some examples of settings, games that are set in our world, or, a recreation of the real world? Assassin's Creed. I think that is set like in the past, right? I mean, I guess it's technically. What? Yeah. Uh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that while that does make sense, it's not exactly what's meant by our world, because while it is like accurate and it does depict these two different time periods, it's still talking about like a historical time period, right? I actually haven't played it, so I might be wrong about this, but that's my impression. Whereas when we think about our world, we think about like the world that we, live in. So that would, sort of like confined to present day. And obviously present day changes if you're talking about a game that was made in the 80s versus a game that was made today, but present day to when the game was made. Plague Inc. Evolved. I don't know that one. I'm going to look that up. Let's see. Oh, this is PlayStation. Where's... Okay, we can look at it on Steam. Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess this is a good example. Realistic simulation. A pathogen has infected patient zero. You now must bring about the end of human history by evolving a deadly global plague whilst adapting against everything humanity can do to defend itself. Yeah, that's a good example, especially for our current time period. But yeah, a simulation game. Like any simulation game typically is going to be, the setting is our world. It's the world that we recognize. So that's a good example. That's a creative example. Astral Chain, if it's set in the future, it's probably not our world since it is in the future. But that might be a good. If the red dimension exists, I don't know is that something that's in the Astral Chain. Maybe Watch Dogs. I actually haven't played Watch Dogs, but I think based on what it looks like I've seen videos of it, that probably makes sense. Spider-Man, I don't think is our world, just because even though it has like a faithful representation of the world we live in, it involves supernatural elements, like, the whole spider bite creating the superpowers thing is not part of our world. So it's a little bit of a combo. Okay. CSGO, yeah, I think that one's supposed to be very realistic. GTA is another good example of like it represents our world. So I think everything in GTA is something that exists in the real world. So yeah, the game has to be realistic. So the one I usually use as the example for this is like The Sims. Like The Sims is literally just creating our world. Like everything that you put in The Sims is something that could exist in the real world. So that's kind of the basic concept. There's obviously a lot of overlap. Like I think a lot of you guys gave examples of games that have really realistic depictions of things, but also involve sort of supernatural elements. So that kind of takes them a little bit outside of our world, but it is kind of still referencing this idea of a simulation or recreating the world that we live in. So those are good examples. Let's go to the next one. Okay, sci-fi. So this is probably an easy one, but what are some examples of sci-fi, and how does it differentiate from fantasy or other genres? You're on the right track, but I think that's actually a good point to talk about, is the difference between the setting and the genre, or the type of world. Space is often used in sci-fi, but it's not required by sci-fi, and not everything that's in space is sci-fi, right? Like you could have a simulation of flying a space. What do we have? We don't have spaceships. We have rocket ships, or like the SpaceX launcher. You could have a video game based on that, and that would be our world, even though it goes into space. But we often do see space as a setting for sci-fi, but those two things could be separate. Alien Isolation is a good one for sci-fi. Star Wars is a good one for sci-fi. Library of Rena, I don't know that. Let's take a look at that one. Okay. Got it. Well, cool. Yeah, that's a great example. That looks very cool. So yeah, I think you guys are kind of like And Brandon said usually it's technology advancement versus magic. So yeah, that's kind of the thing that we usually think of separating sci-fi and fantasy. Although obviously there's a ton of overlap. Is that sci-fi tends to relate on so it's science-based fiction, right? It's usually technology or things related to science like advancement, like evolution or something like that. But it's usually related to some kind of science that doesn't actually exist, but maybe theoretically could exist. And so the thing that makes the world different is the technology, typically is sci-fi. So BioShock is a good example. That's so BioShock is sort of like, I guess, in the steampunk genre, which is a more kind of like niche genre of sci-fi, which is basically like going to the past and then imagining a different future with different technology is kind of how cyberpunk works. So, the technology in BioShock doesn't really exist, but it sort of borrows aesthetics of the past, but then kind of advances them. So that's a good example. Cyberpunk, I haven't actually played, but it seems like, yes, it certainly looks like sci-fi. I don't know Saints Row. What is that game? Huh. Oh, I see. There's some. Okay. Is there like a technology component to this? Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, that's a good example. No Man's Sky is a good one. Mega Man is a good one. StarCraft, yeah, all these are good. Halo is a good one. Dead Space is one I'm not familiar with. Let's check that out. Science fiction horror. Cool. Yeah, this looks cool. So yeah, those are some good examples. So there is often a lot of overlap between sci-fi and fantasy, and really all of these different genres. Like a lot of games kind of borrow from lots of different genres to create like a unique blend. But those are some good examples. So then the next one is historical/period. So what are some examples of games that are historical or period settings? Stronghold. It's another one. You guys are coming up with a lot of games I've never heard of, so that's exciting for me. Yeah, this looks like a good one. Stronghold. Oh, this is an old one. This is a throwback. Okay, so real-time strategy. So yeah, that's a lot of real-time strategy or simulation games will also be historical or period-based. Call of Duty, it's a good one. Mordhau, I don't know that one. Medieval hack and slash, okay, that's a good one. Like ones in the past, like World War II, yes, that's a good example. Red Dead Redemption is a good one. Every Civilization game is another good example. Yeah, those are all good examples. So usually with historical and period games, they are set in a time in the past, and they're trying to recreate aspects of that time. So they'll recreate the technology. They might recreate the socio-political environment or different aspects, and then put us, in the case of a lot of simulation games work this way, like Civilization, where you're kind of like managing resources and politics and stuff like that. And it's based on this previous time period where we kind of know, what happened, but we can relive it or maybe try to see what would happen if different factors were at play. So that's what a lot of those historical and period games are kind of, that's what they're using as their game mechanic. Fate Grand Order, that's another one I have to look up. Mobile game. Okay. Yeah, this sounds like maybe more fantasy, but I think that makes sense. Yeah, there's some spells and stuff. So I guess this is like historical slash fantasy. It's more time travel. So yeah, time travel is kind of like, maybe it's magic, maybe it's sci-fi. It could be different things. But then I guess it brings in the historical stuff into it if you're depicting other periods of time. So that's kind of doing all of those at the same time. But those are all good examples. Let's keep going. Okay, mythological. So this is another one that's good to think about, like, how does mythological, like, what is that setting? How does that differentiate from, fantasy or historical? Any examples of mythological settings for games? God of War, yeah. Uh-huh, that's a good one. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of fantasy kind of like borrows mythological elements. Having a mythological setting might be a little bit different. Like Hades actually is a really good example because it's set in hell. Hell comes from mythology, right? It comes from Dante, Inferno, and what's the other one? Paradise Lost. Like those depictions of hell kind of inform the setting of games that are set in the underworld or in hell. So that's a good example. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so again, there's going to be a lot of overlap, but mythological specifically is borrowing characters or themes or settings from mythology. And mythology is typically, stories that are shared by a culture. Whether, we tend to think of like the Greek gods as the sort of like, or, the Greek mythology or Roman mythology. We tend to think of those as like, that's mythology. But it can include things like heaven and hell are part of another mythology. Other, any kind of like cultural, like shared cultural story that we have can be a setting, can be a mythological setting in a game. Kid Icarus, I don't know that one. Let's take a look at that. I mean, it makes sense because Icarus is from mythology. Yeah, so based on Greek mythology. So yeah, that's a perfect example. Smite, that's another game I don't know. I'm gonna have to look through all of these. We'll do. Okay. Okay, yeah. Control a god, goddess, or other mythological figure. Okay, that's a good one. Okami, I don't know that one either. Oh, I've seen this before. Yeah, this game looks cool. I've never played this, but I've seen some videos of this. Yeah, that's a good example. So Japanese mythology. Um, World of Warcraft. I actually haven't played World of Warcraft, but I'm sure there are some mythological references in there. Blacksmith Wukong. Blacksmith Wukong. I don't know that one. Called what? Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like a mythological reference. Okay, based on the classical 16th century Chinese novel. Oh yeah, Journey to the West. That's cool. That okay. So this is an upcoming game. Oh, and it's not coming out to 2023, so we have a little while for this one. But this looks cool. That's a good reference. Call of Cthulhu is that's a good one. That's a good one. Hunter's Arena. I don't know that one. Okay, set in ancient Asia. Yeah, so that's a really good example. It's using this specific setting to kind of set up what the game mechanics are going to be. So that looks good. All right, those are good examples. Okay, fictional world. And notice there's a little addendum here from an existing fiction like Star Trek. So I kind of already gave this one away with the example, but it's kind of hard to explain what this is otherwise. But essentially what this means is you're borrowing the fictional world created by some other type of media or franchise or something like that. So, Star Trek is like a very popular TV show that existed for a long time. And of course, one of the things that happens is you have spin-off games that are based on that world. So you can probably all name a million of those, like the Spider-Man games would be a good example of that. The Star Wars, any Star Wars game would be a good example of that. But essentially, the fictional world already exists. It was created by somebody else, and then you are just borrowing that fictional world. And, most of the time it's like the company that's doing the game is somehow contracted by or related to the company that made the original thing. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you could just be, inspired by something or borrowing characters or settings from another world. So that one is pretty straightforward, but it is another very common type of game setting. So yeah, there's a Star Trek game. You can see I like this because it's not just the setting of the game. Now it's like the actual console. Like everything is kind of like built in to creating the expectations for this game, right? We know what Star Trek is. We know what the sort of like differences of the Star Trek world are versus our own world. And so that can set up our expectations. Like, oh, are we going to be able to teleport and fly through space and do the things that we see in Star Trek? So it's a way of kind of like priming, which is like preparing your player to have certain expectations, and that kind of leads them to try different things in the game world. So it's kind of like setting up what you might be able to do in that game world. Okay, let's keep going. So things that we have to consider as we're setting up our game world. So physical dimensions. This is something that we have to think about, the relationship between like the physical dimensions of the real world versus or the fantasy world, whatever our world is, versus what we represent in the game. So we want to choose like specific physical dimensions. Most like game engines will kind of have these things already set up for you, like built in. Like they might have like the default unit be like 3 feet or a meter in world space, in like what you would expect the real world to be like. So a lot of the time the game engine will kind of set that up for you, but you can kind of make decisions around what those physical dimensions are. Like how many miles wide is my level, or is it all contained inside of one room, like that 12 Hours game that we saw previously. Talking about 2D versus 3D games, this can be a big factor as far as setting up the setting. Like what can we represent? How do we represent things in 2D versus 3D? How does that change the kind of visuals that we are going to add into the game? Boundaries, I kind of just like talked about this with the example of the room, but just thinking about defining the boundaries. So some games you can see like the whole game world just by looking at it. So the example I give of that is Tetris. It's kind of hard to see on this color background. I don't know why I can't click on this. Oh well. But Tetris is the example there. You can see the entire game world, everything that exists in that game, just by looking directly at the screen. most game or a lot of games you have to explore the world, whether it's a simulation and you're just like moving the map around, or if it's a first person game and you have to like walk around and explore things to figure out what the boundaries of the world are. We as the game designer have to think about those boundaries and how do we communicate those boundaries. Like if there's a game where there's just a bunch of open empty space, but we don't kind of communicate like there's nothing over there, and the player spends all day just like walking through an empty space, in some games that might be part of the experience. Like I know in Red Dead Redemption there's a lot of just like walking through spaces. So that might be part of the game experience, but that's a choice that we make as a designer, or it should be a choice that we make as a designer, not something that where we just kind of like forget to draw the boundary. So we do want to think about what are the boundaries of our setting. Then we have scale. Scale is another way to communicate both the functionality of the game and the setting to players. So like in The Sims, like the scale of the player matches the scale of the house. Everything is supposed to be as it is in the real world. But you might have other games where, you know, you play like a tiny ant and you can run around. Or the scale might change, like you might be able to shrink or grow or change the scale in other ways. That perspective game, I'm already forgetting the name of it. What was that game called? I do really want to play that game, but I keep forgetting about it. Where was that? I can't find it. Okay. Superliminal. Yes. Yeah. That one. So like you're literally changing the scale of the objects in that game. So that's another thing to think about with setting. So like a good example for this is the game Katamari Damacy. I bet a lot of you guys have played that. It's kind of an older game, but you're probably familiar with it. Here we see The Sims, where everything is just realistic. Everything is set to the right scale. In Katamari, the whole game mechanic is just like running through town and collecting these things, and it's sort of like growing in size. And it's this kind of absurdity of the scale of that game is a big part of what's fun about that experience. So that's another way that we can play with scale. So some of the elements to think about in a game. I should update this. We're actually not doing that this week. I have to change some of these notes. But when you are starting to set up the scenery for your game, you're going to think about the terrain. The terrain is like the stuff that you can walk on. Is it roads? Is it dirt? Is it a wood floor inside of a house? What is the player kind of like? What is the floor, or what is the player on? Then there's rules. So that's part of the setting, and that is related to game mechanics as well. But the setting, the way that the setting looks is governed by physical rules, things like gravity. So if we're in space, things are floating around. If we're not in space, then things are sticking to the ground. Basic stuff like that. Flora and fauna are another aspect of the setting that we can use to communicate different parts of our world. Flora meaning like plants, basically, and fauna meaning animals. So flora are things that are typically standing still, like trees or bushes or, grass, things like that. And then fauna might be moving around to give a sense of life or things happening in the game. Cultural artifacts are another way that we can communicate the setting of a game. So things like stores in a city, or a church, or some sort of mythological sculpture or statue or something like that. Some signifiers of the culture that we are sort of in that world. Screen space is another consideration with setting. We're going to be working on 2D games in this class. So we need to think about how do we divide up the scene as with the screen space that we have, right? Like we have this two-dimensional plane, so we can't really work in 3D, but we still have to communicate, where the top of the world is and the bottom of the world and the sides and all these things. So we have to think about how to break up, is the top the sky and the bottom is the floor, or do we represent it from a top-down perspective? These are different things that are informed by the setting. Having a background and foreground, working with vertical space, as I was just talking about, like having different parts of the screen represent different areas, horizontal space. Another aspect of the setting is the physical time. So this is just like literally how does time work in the game. In most games, time just kind of works like normal. Like time passes, people move at a regular rate. Your character might like run or jump or different things, and time kind of dictates how that action looks. Time usually moves forward, but we've seen there are examples of games that play with that, like reversing time or traveling back and forth in time or slowing time down. Can the user control time? We saw an example of that. I forget the name of it, but somebody mentioned a game where was that the Life is Unreal one, I think, where the character can control time. Life is Strange. Yeah. Thank you. In where? Prince of Persia. Okay, I haven't played that, but that sounds fun. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I feel like I've seen like the cover of it at some point, but I've never played it. Okay, so we've thought about all these different aspects of how we create the setting. So when we're thinking about our own game and coming up with what we want to put in the setting to communicate what's going on, we can look at different things for inspiration. I showed earlier that example of the fish tank. I think that's like a really good example of these kind of like mini worlds. There's a lot of other examples that I like to look at. This is just kind of like me personally when I'm thinking about this stuff. This isn't like some big design rule or something like that, but it's just something that helps me think about what to put in a game. Again, the thing with fish bowls is they're really, really simple. They communicate things with just a few elements. So there's the architecture of the fish bowl. There's, this one uses this kind of like funny, like hanging ledge thing, and then it's got red sand instead of brown sand. There's a bunch of different examples in here. This one is the iPod setup. It's kind of funny. This one kind of looks like a video game. This one is a telephone booth. So there's a lot of examples in here. There's other things that are kind of like this. This is where I got that image from. So I think this kind of can help, come up with some creative ways to think of what to put in the game world, because we do have to kind of make these choices. Like, how do I communicate the setting with just a few simple choices? This is another one is like landscape and garden design is actually, I think, really useful for thinking about some of the same aspects, like colors, like what colors to use, how to balance your color, architecture, like how to, set things up so it's easy to understand where things are, like where the important parts of the world are. All these different things that go into like designing a garden are very similar to designing the scene for a game. So thinking about the color theme, these contrasts between like the greens and the reds and the oranges, varying height. It's actually like a really good, you wouldn't necessarily think of it, but yeah, it's the real world has like things that are lots of different heights, different textures. That's another way to add variety to your scene. Colorful foliage, kind of same thing with colors. Another video on designing a garden. This is kind of similar, but there's a lot of kind of simple rules in here that are helpful. I'm just gonna kind of scroll through these. You guys can watch these in more depth if you're interested. They are kind of silly, but I do think it helps if you create these rules before you start designing, because then you know what you're going to design. You're not just like throwing random stuff in there. So looking through some of these things can be a useful way to get inspiration. Landscape design. So this is another one with a bunch of lessons. Contrast. So contrast between colors or shapes. It's a good thing to think about. Texture again. Color. This has some good examples of contrasting colors versus harmonious colors. Scale. We kind of talked a little bit about scale. They have some good examples of using this. Repetition is actually a really good one for games because the way that games are set up, we are always, maybe not always, but almost always we're going to be repeating elements. Like we're going to be repeating that grass texture over and over again. But there's also ways of using design and repetition that can be useful for, you know, grounding the player, showing the player what's going on. Rhythm is a good one. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different stuff in here. I'm just going to kind of skip through these. So again, these are just like what I look at for inspiration. They're not what you guys have to look at for inspiration. I'm just using them as examples. Terrariums are another thing where it's like you have a very small amount of space and you want to communicate something specific in that small space. So that's another good way to look at things, like what are the fewest number of elements that I can communicate the setting of this game. Aquascaping, that's another good one. Again, these are just things that I think are cool to look at. You know, look wherever you want for inspiration. There's a lot of different things that can kind of help you with that. Cool. All right, I think that's everything from here. So normally this is related to like a specific assignment in the class. This semester, obviously, we're doing things a little bit differently. So this is more kind of related to some labs that you probably won't do. Where's the skill tree? For a little bit, like the tile sets and platforms is kind of related. The scenery and backgrounds. So those are ones that you might do next week or in a couple weeks. Then for the designer, it's, you know, thinking about level design is related in there. But also, you know, as we're starting to actually like build stuff, we want to be thinking about what are the games that we want to make and what do we need to create to make those games work. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording, and then if you guys have questions, we can continue.